In Joshua chapter 1, the Lord promises that if we follow His ways and obey His commands, He'll give us success wherever we go. He promises that if we meditate on His Word and walk in His Word, He will make us prosperous in everything that we do. That sounds incredible. But before we start counting our blessings, we need to explore the answer to a really important question. What does He actually mean by that? Success and prosperity, according to Jesus. Coming up next on Truth for Africa. Years ago, we were seeking to buy a piece of land for our discipleship training center, and a friend of mine asked me, have you stepped on that piece of land and claimed Joshua 1 verse 3 for yourself? Because he said the Lord promises, wherever you put the sole of your foot, I will give that land to you. Well, it sounded like a big, literal step of faith. But listen, faith in something that God does not promise is not true faith at all. And so I shared an important Bible study principle with him, something we all need to understand if we're going to be able to trust and walk in the many wonderful promises of God in His Word. And that's this: we need to know who the Bible's about. The Bible is God's revelation of Himself, of His plan, and then of our place in His plan. It's not a book of promises that we can just grab and use to manipulate God to fulfill all of our plans. The book of Joshua is not about the life and blessings of a man called Joshua. It's the story of God and how He used Joshua to lead Israel into the land that God had chosen for them and promised to them long ago through Abraham. So to pull out that verse and think that we can use it to claim land for ourselves today is absolutely ridiculous. It's a huge misunderstanding of what God is really promising. We need to understand a few things about this. First of all, He wasn't promising to give land personally to Joshua. He was promising to give His people that particular piece of land. And in verse 3 He says, just as I spoke to Moses. In other words, this promise to Joshua is directly tied to His promise to Moses. And the promise to Moses was directly tied to His promise He'd made long ago to Abraham. Israel was God's people. They were following His call, and now they were entering unfamiliar territory, and they were going to face many obstacles and many enemies. And so the Lord is assuring Joshua, as His chosen leader, that He will not fail to keep His promises that He has made to His people. He will lead them faithfully into the land. That's the context. Think about this, what was going on. Moses was the greatest leader the people of Israel ever knew. But now Moses was dead. And God chose Joshua to take over to lead God's people into the promised land. That must have been an overwhelming task to step into the shoes of Moses and try to do his job. That's why God tells Joshua 3 times in these 9 verses, be strong and courageous. God's not making promises to Joshua of personal prosperity. He's giving Joshua confidence that the Lord will be faithful to His promises to His people. He's telling Joshua that as the leader of His people, he can be absolutely confident that no one will be able to stand in the way of what God is doing to accomplish God's purposes through Joshua for God's people. Don't worry, he says in verse 5. Just as I was with Moses to help him lead my people, I will also be with you. Second, leading them into the land was not a reward for Israel's righteousness and faithfulness. A lot of people look at verse 7 in Joshua chapter 1 and think that what God is saying is if you obey, if you do all of the right things, if you avoid all of the wrong things, then I will reward you by giving you this land. And of course, we add on all kinds of other success, which we'll talk about in a moment. But in Deuteronomy chapter 9, the Lord made it very clear to Moses that Israel shouldn't think that the reason He's driving the Canaanites from the promised land so to clear a place for Israel to live isn't because Israel was so faithful and righteous and that God just wants to shower them with blessings because of that. No, God says, I'm clearing the Canaanites to judge them for their wickedness. And then He tells him 3 times that it is not a reward for Israel's obedience. In fact, he says, the truth is, you are the most stubborn and rebellious people. This was an act of God's mercy and grace. And third, he wasn't giving them the land to just enjoy and do whatever they wanted to do with it. He was promising it to them to lead them into the land for a very specific and clear purpose, so that in the land they would be his people, walking in his purposes for his glory. Okay, you say, so maybe we can't use this verse to claim land. But it does say in verses 7 and 8 that if we obey his word, he promises that he will prosper us and cause us to have success in everything, right? Yeah, he does promise that. But we have to understand what those words actually mean. Because when we hear those words, success and prosperity, we already have our definition of what that means. And so we read those verses and we get really excited about everything we think God is promising to us. But that word that's translated as success here doesn't mean that your education and your career will flourish. The word actually means to be prudent or to act with wisdom. What he's promising Joshua is that if he will cling to God's word, if he will obey him, then the Lord will guide him. The Lord will give him the wisdom that he needs to lead his people into the land just like he promised. The general principle here for us is that if we meditate on God's word, if we obey God's word, if we give ourselves fully to live for God's purposes, he will not fail to give us the wisdom that we need to walk in his ways. He will not fail to give us the ability to be and do everything that he has called us to be and do. It's very similar to the idea in Proverbs chapter 3, where he says, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. The other word in verse 8 that's translated as prosperous, it doesn't refer to material wealth and comfort. It's referring to the idea of succeeding in the task for which you were sent. It's like when Abraham sent his servant to find a wife for Isaac, and the servant asks the Lord to guide him, this is what he said, so that I might prosper in my way. He's not saying, guide me so that I can get a new car and a big house. He was saying, I'm sent for something, Lord, and I want you to prosper me. In other words, I want you to help me to accomplish that for which I was sent. And that's exactly what the Lord is promising in Joshua chapter 1. He had sent Joshua to lead his people into the land of Canaan. And now he's promising Joshua that if he will listen to his word and obey his word, then he will make sure that Joshua accomplishes what God sent him to do. And the promise for us is that if we focus our hearts on loving him, if we focus our hearts and lives on walking in his ways, then he will do everything in us and through us to make it possible for his purposes to be accomplished in our lives. Listen, if you go to the Bible looking for promises that you'll get that degree, that your career will be successful, that you'll get a new car, that you'll become someone important in the eyes of the world, if that's what you're looking for in the scriptures, then all of this is bad news. But if your heart really belongs to the Lord, if your true desire really is to love him and to serve him with all of your heart, if you're committed to following Jesus and giving your life for his purposes, to glorify him as his witness in this world, as a disciple of Jesus who makes disciples, if that's your heart's desire, then this is the best news and the best promise, because the promise to Joshua then becomes our promise too. Let me paraphrase what he's saying with all of our definitions included. Just as I have been with Moses, just as I have been with Joshua, just as I have been with all of my faithful servants in history, I will be with you, and I will not fail you. I will not forsake you. So be strong and courageous. And if you will fix your eyes on me, if you will walk in my ways for my purposes wherever you go, I promise I will give you the wisdom that you need to do it. I will never fail to lead you. I will never fail to guide you on the path that will lead you to accomplishing my purposes in your life. If you will meditate on my word and obey my word, if you will surrender your life to my will, then I will make sure, God promises, that you have everything that you need in order to do his will. I will accomplish through you, God promises, my purposes. So don't fear, because the Lord your God, as you walk with him, will be with you wherever you go.